And we're back now with our political panel for some analysis on a week we're still reeling from in many ways. Ben, we haven't even talked about the fact that Speaker Ryan decided on a timeline that surprised many to step away from public life and go home to Wisconsin. The timing surprised many people. What does this do to the horse race?
Well, in terms of the horse race, I don't think it changes it all that much. It's certainly a sign, though, that Speaker Ryan was not that optimistic that November would be very good for House Republicans. The race to replace him looks to be pretty decidedly in favor of Kevin McCarthy, but that's something that could definitely be for the minority leader position as opposed to the Speaker of the House after November. Ryan leaving is really a tale of a politician who had a moment in time when everyone in Washington thought that he was going to be the next clean-cut, wonky leader of the Republican coalition for decades to come.
You call him a young gun.
Yes. Well, that was his branding at the time, along with the departed Eric Cantor and McCarthy himself. It was one of those things, though, where I think that Ryan was very much, as much as he was a significant player in terms of charting the policy future for the GOP from the sort of post-Obama moment on, he was also someone who was out of step, I think, increasingly with the culture warrior mindset of a lot of the Republican base. And his focus on telling stories through histograms and through Excel sheets was not something that actually connected with the Republican base in a way that would allow
is that marketing, or is that actually the death of fiscal conservatism? I mean, you had Bob Corker, the senator, out there saying that, this Congress and this administration are going to go down as one of the most fiscally irresponsible in history.
Right.
Yeah, fiscal conservatism, I think, is dead until the point when a Democrat returns to the White House. And
maybe. I mean, look, he accomplished all he could, and I think he knew that at this point it's only going to get worse for him. Usually in the modern era, speakers don't get to leave on their own terms. By doing it now, that far out, he essentially gets to set the table for his departure, and by anointing his preferred successor, sort of leaves it to Republicans to say, you will sort this out later. But I think he's correct in saying that whoever is in charge of the Republican conference will have no bearing on results in November. And the message he kept sending, I think, to his colleagues was, get out there and win your race. Do everything you need to do to get reelected. And if you can't do it, well, that's on you. The headwinds are certainly not in the, they're going against Republicans, and it's going to be a bad year for them, it looks like, if you believe the forecasting. And he knows that. But we should also give him some credit. He's been in Congress for 20 years. He's only 48, so think about that, 28-year-old. All of his kids have been born since he got into Congress. Family considerations were a legitimate part of this. I think that is true. But again, he gets to do what so few speakers have done in the last 30, 40 years, and that is get out when he can.
Well, but you did hear some angst. I heard some angst from some Republicans on the Hill that he was leaving right now and not after the election. Right. And he was asked about that, and he said it would have felt dishonest for him to know he was going to step down. But there was this feeling that he was sort of the general abandoning his troops in the middle of a fight. And so I think that's part of the reason he rushed to anoint McCarthy, was to prevent there being a very messy leadership fight in the middle of a very difficult election cycle for Republicans. And
isn't that clean, or will the Freedom Caucus have their say in this? Is Kevin McCarthy, does he have this on lock?
I don't know, but I think probably so. I think, with Ryan, if Trump goes along with this, and Trump likes McCarthy very much, and we believe that McCarthy is probably Trump's preferred speaker, McCarthy had problems last time. There were doubts about his ability to lead. But I think things have changed a lot since then. And what was a very difficult job for Paul Ryan might actually be an easier job for McCarthy, because we won't have this Hamlet act with regard to Trump. Right? Ryan was so clearly always fighting his own demons, and he was getting asked in every press conference to, this hand-wringing about Trump. It was very clear that he didn't like the guy, but that he had to be allies with the guy. McCarthy's been buddies with Trump from the beginning, and to the extent that, Republicans in Congress basically want to do whatever Trump wants them to do, I think that'll be much easier for McCarthy to bring them together around
the
that.
benefits of being a Californian instead of a Midwesterner.
And yet I think Ed's right. Part of the message that Paul Ryan is sending is, save yourself. Don't wait for the president to save you.
Are there more Republican departures? I mean,
there are what?
damaging
I
is
think there's
this?
19 states that haven't had their filing deadlines yet. In the wake of the Speaker's decision, a guy named Dennis Ross from Florida announced he too was retiring. You ask Democrats, they've got a list of about another 24 that could conceivably do it. We'll see if they do. The Democrats need to come up with 23 seats to retake it. Looks like at this point perhaps they could do that. Question will be whether they get many more after that. And backfilling retirements, resignations, promotions for Republicans is a big part of their problem. Ryan being Exhibit A at this point, there's some forecasting now that thinks that his seat is in play.
Margaret, one of the things that's been uncomfortable for some Senate Republicans, particularly from states that produce agricultural products, the president's announcements on tariffs. Then this week you had him, after this meeting with some senators from those states, say, well, let's take another look at the Asia-Pacific trade deal that he had already said he was going to exit. Yeah. They took that as a sign of hope. The president then tweeted the next day, a little bit of a walk back. Is this just to settle the room? Is this a policy shift? I mean, what does the president walk into this meeting with the Japanese prime minister this week and tell him his position is on TPP?
Yeah, this is a truly fascinating new turn. The president has hinted for some months that there was some potential in theory to talk about reentering the TPP, but it seemed that he had taken it to a new level this week. He emerged from that meeting with Midwestern leaders. Ben Sass made it a point to lay down a marker and say he told Lighthizer and Larry Kudlow, he tapped them to figure out if and how we should reenter the TPP. And I think Sass put down that marker on purpose to put it out there. But here's what's happened. Getting out of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was one of the first things President Trump did in office. The tariff thing has not played well on the stock market and has not played well with some of the Trump voters, some of the Trump base. And this seems to be a testing, a floating of the idea of reentering. Everyone in the TPP says they would welcome the U.S. back, but many
don't want to renegotiate.
Many in the TPP says the terms are set. You guys missed your window. We are not cracking this thing open, but we think it's good for you and good for the rest of the world and good for, to some extent, countering China to have the U.S. back in. And now the president has a real decision to make.
The president ran in 2016 on a platform that sounded frequently protectionist and isolationist. The fact is that as president, his policies have not been as protectionist or isolationist as you might have predicted based on what he was saying at the time. I think this is another example of how he kind of wants to play both sides of these things. He likes the idea of protectionism and tariffs in certain respects, but he really doesn't like the idea of Wall Street's reaction to that.
All right. Thank you very much to all of you. We'll be back in a moment to talk about what's next for the U.S. in Syria.
Facebook's head of global safety.
We want to take a closer look at the situation in Syria with retired Navy Admiral James Winnefeld, a former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and now a CBS News military and homeland security analyst. Also with us is Ambassador James Jeffrey, the former U.S. envoy to Turkey and Iraq under President George W. Bush and under the Obama administration as well. Thank you both for coming on the show. Admiral, this attack in Syria hit 3 locations. The Pentagon says it set the chemical weapons program back at least a few years. How do you assess its efficacy?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that more than anything else, this attack was about the international community standing up one more time to prevent the normalization of the use of chemical weapons. Remember, it's not too long ago that the community did this as well when Russia made an assassination attempt in Britain, and many countries ejected Russian diplomats. Well, this is yet another example of that community standing up and pushing back, saying we're not going to allow this to happen.
Do you see that, would this have happened were it not for what you just described happening in the UK with that poisoning of that former Russian agent?
Yes, I think it would have happened. And it's a question of how much accumulated misbehavior on the part of Assad regime using chemical weapons is enough to stack up where the international community says, you know, it's time to do something about this. Whether or not it results in Assad not using chemical weapons again is certainly going to be open for debate. We'll see whether that happens. But the important thing is that the community has stood up and said we are not going to tolerate the normalization of the use of chemical weapons.
Ambassador, what does the Assad regime take away from this? This is the second time they've been hit by a U.S. strike.
I think, Margaret, that the assessment on their part is the Trump administration is concerned about dealing with the symptoms of the underlying problem, the Syrian civil war, and as Nikki Haley mentioned, Iran's expansion into the vacuum, such as ISIS, such as the chemical weapons, but is not going to do very much against the underlying problem that is destabilizing the whole region.
That sounds a lot like some of the criticisms of the Obama administration strategy in Syria, or lack of it.
It's very similar. Again, it's dealing with the symptoms. The Trump administration a bit more with military force, which is not a bad thing and could have results, at least on the chemical weapons front, but it's not, again, tackling what the problem is, and turning to the Arab states and expecting them to stand up not just to Iran but to Russia is no way to get out of this mess.
Admiral, is there a takeaway that we can learn in terms of how this strike was decided? Aaron David Miller, longtime diplomat, said that the key takeaway is not what happened in Syria, but what didn't, that Mattis was able to de-escalate. Is that your read?
It is, and I think that when you consider that a strike like this really is on the ragged edge of international law, when that happens, it's very important to have a very tight target set and to have a coalition behind you, and that's exactly what happened. And that's one of the reasons why it took a while to get this thing together. It didn't happen the day after the chemical attacks occurred. You not only have to bring the coalition together, you have to very carefully examine the policy implications of what you're about to do. And it was a very, very complex strike that was very well executed. It takes time to get that together.
And Russia held its fire. What do you make of that?
I think Russia understands that they're on the wrong side of history here. They're on a roll.
Do they? They've been on the right side in terms of who's winning the war for the past 7 years.
Well, they're on a roll here. They've illegally annexed the Crimea. They've interfered in our elections. They have tried to assassinate somebody in Great Britain, and now they're backing a monster who is using chemical weapons against his own people. So I think the writing was on the wall in the Kremlin. Certainly they're going to push back publicly, no question about it, but I think they realize that even if they could have interfered with the strike, which is debatable, I don't think that they were going to do too much.
Ambassador, President Trump, again, in his announcement of these strikes, reiterated his intent to not stay in Syria, a gesture to bringing those U.S. troops home. You've said that's actually not a bad decision. What do you think that would mean if you bring those boots who are there, the 2,000 or so, and pull them out?
Pulling the ground troops out, Margaret, because I think they're doing at this point a peripheral mission of dealing with the remnants of ISIS is not a bad idea because Americans are very nervous about this. But maintaining overall military pressure, no-fly zones, action against chemical weapons, essentially what Israel is doing and what Turkey is doing in other parts of Syria would be the building blocks of a real strategy if we could unite everybody behind one.
You don't see that as vacating the battlefield to Iran?
No, because I think that we would have to continue to provide, as we did with the Iraqi Kurds after 1991, air cover and some kind of liaison capability so that that terrain becomes denied to Assad and the Iranians.
And that would require the Trump administration agreeing to protect some of these areas in the south. And they haven't necessarily said they would do that if Assad's forces go into these so-called ceasefire zones.
True, and I think it's really important to remember that the actual reason why our forces are there in the first place, under international law, and that is to defeat ISIL, not to overthrow the Assad regime or some other ambition. There are probably peripheral sides to that idea, but legally the reason why we're there is collective self-defense with our partners in the region against ISIL.
Ambassador, in the next few weeks, we're going to see a lot of potential flashpoints. You've got the Iraqi elections. You've also got President Trump needing to make a decision on the Iran nuclear deal. What do you think is going to happen here? I mean, can you put those pieces together for us?
They all circle around the central point, which is a shift in the geostrategic structure of a critically important region, the Middle East, by Iran, enabled by Russia, and helped by its proxies such as Assad. There's an Iraq aspect to that, a Yemen, and also a nuclear agreement aspect to it. The president wants to pull out of the nuclear agreement. For my money, that's not a good idea. He should focus more on putting together that kind of alliance that can deal across the board with what Iran is doing, and then put some military and economic muscle behind what Nikki Haley told you earlier is the Geneva political process. Diplomacy is fine, but as a former diplomat, it doesn't work without pressure.
All right, Ambassador, Admiral, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll be right back.